This is Shane Morris with exciting news about the 2024 Colson Center National Conference. We've expanded the CC&C experience to provide greater opportunities for you to learn, apply, and engage, so you can be equipped to live courageously wherever God has placed you. Enhanced breakout sessions will be catered to specific vocations and interests. With the help of experienced Colson Center coaches, these interactive sessions will translate main session teachings into practical application for your unique context. Along the way, you'll have more time to link arms and strategize with other Christians who are facing the very same challenges. Take advantage of our lowest ticket price, which is being offered at a 50% discount before rates go up on October 31st. Register today at colsonconference.org. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. All around the world and all throughout history, there is an assumption, if not quite universal, then nearly so, that when a person dies, they don't cease to exist. They live on in some form, and often they remain essentially the person they were in life, whether it's ancient Egyptians, Vikings, Native Americans, or Chinese, or Greeks, or Romans even. Basically, everyone in history came to this common belief that people are something more than their bodies, which decay to dust after death. A belief in the existence of the soul has deep roots for mankind. And it obviously plays a huge role in Christian theology, not least because we worship a risen Savior. And we believe the Jesus who rose on the third day was the same Jesus who died on the cross. Christians further believe that we will survive death and be given resurrected bodies at Christ's return. Well, given all this, how do we find ourselves in a world where every serious thinker and scientist is expected to disbelieve in the soul? What happened that this near universal intuition of mankind was cast aside? And are there still credible reasons to believe that we are more than just our bodies? With me today to answer these questions is the author of a new deep dive book on this subject. Joshua Farris is Humboldt Experienced Researcher Fellow at the University of Bochum, Germany. He's the Associate Editor for the Journal of Biblical and Theological Studies, as well as the European Journal of Philosophy of Religion. His latest book is called The Creation of Self, A Case for the Soul, and it's rich, rich stuff, so buckle up, folks. Joshua Farris, welcome to Upstream.
Hey, good to be with you, Shane. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. You know, when I look at you, I see something obvious. It's the only way I've ever known you thus far, and that is the body, the picture of the body that is coming to me over the screen right now from however distant we happen to be. And it's mediating our whole exchange, right? The sound of your voice, the appearance of your face, even the clothes with which you have veiled yourself, arrayed yourself. And these are not part of you, obviously, but they're part of the physical avatar that is you. And it's the same way when I look at myself, even in the mirror. In fact, the only way I experience myself in terms of visual and auditory and tactile stimuli is as a body. So given all that, where do you think human beings get this idea that we're more than just our bodies?
Oh, yeah, big question, big question. As you pointed out in the introduction, I think the idea that we are more than our bodies at a minimum, some kind of soul, as the ancients often put it, and then later the moderns would call something like a mind or something of the sort. This was the common belief across history in most religions and most customs. Historically, I think Stuart Getz and Mark Baker in their book, The Soul Hypothesis, said it well. Yeah, this has just been the belief throughout most of history in most cultures and religions. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. Certainly, as you pointed out, we are embodied. And so that seems to be certainly an important part of who we are and an important part of how we arrive at certain beliefs about the world. But there's something about the nature of knowledge itself, something about the nature of consciousness, something about the nature of conscious experience and entering into relationships with other persons that seems to transcend at least materialistic explanations or seem to be not strictly speaking identical with the material, the physical, the body itself, or parts of the body, even the brain itself. It seems to be more more than the brain or the neurons firing in the brain. Certainly, there are neural correlates of consciousness, maybe that we can point out, and there's been lots of interesting studies done on that by neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. But that itself doesn't point to the fact that we are our brains, or the parts of our brains, or the neurons firing in our brains, or that we are even made sense of by our brains, at least not completely, certainly. There is something more to us than that. And so I think for a variety of reasons, particularly when we think carefully and clearly about our own consciousness and about the states of our consciousness and the kind of knowledge that we have, there is something about it that transcends the material, our bodily, and just in terms of how we think about the world, reasons, experiences in the world themselves. There is something about the nature of what it is like to be or to experience the world, to experience other persons, to experience my spouse, that is unique and transcendent of the physical. It's not just physical, but it is something more.
With so many subjects, Joshua, when we talk about them these days as Christians, we come at them with this prior acknowledgement that people used to think one thing for the most part, even at the highest levels of academia and, elite thought. People thought one way. And then at some point in the last several hundred years, all of that changed and people started thinking another way. So we could talk about sex, we could talk about the way society is organized, we could talk about the role of religion and belief in God, or we could talk about the existence of the soul. So like we said in the opening there, if you look back in history, belief in the soul was extraordinarily universal, that humans are more than just our bodies. And then if you look at Christian history, the highest and greatest scholars of the patristic and medieval period, right into the early modern academy, believed essentially that human beings were more than just material, right? We're more than matter. And then something happened to change it to where it is today, this idea that's sort of mocked or laughed out of the room. What happened there? Could you kind of briefly tell us that story?
Yeah, there's probably a variety of causes, and maybe there's one singular cause that's stronger than the others, but I think there are a variety of different causes. Certainly, go back to the modern discussion with Francis Bacon and René Descartes. René Descartes was encountering this sort of problem a similar problem that we're actually experiencing today in many respects, especially in the last 60 years. René Descartes was responding against the atomists of the day, the kind of materialists of the day, and he was offering up solutions that he saw as satisfactory to what it means to be conscious beings, consciousness. I think, at least in the beginning of modernity, René Descartes won out. But there were other appropriations after him that were motivated by sort of Darwinian or later neo-Darwinian explanations about the world that became somewhat all-inclusive, as one author would put it, one recent contemporary author. She would put it in this sort of way, that there was this sort of universal acid test that would be used to sort of explain everything. And so neo-Darwinian mechanisms became the way in which everything seemed to be explained, including consciousness. So there became this over-reliance upon the scientific method, probably as commonly associated or predicated of Francis Bacon, the sort of strictly speaking empirical method. And over a period of time, given that influence, Darwinian influence, as well as a recent author pointed out, Galileo, and Galileo's emphasis upon quantitative explanations, and how authoritative quantitative explanations in science, or how it became associated or identified with science itself, became dominant in the way in which we explained everything in the world. And so certainly we have lots of reasons to adhere to science as a way to arrive at certain conclusions in the world. Science has made a lot of progress, and I think there's been a recognition that science, as the empirical method itself, has made lots of progress, that there's this growing idea that maybe science can explain everything. And certainly that's been the case in early 1900s there was a sort of a dominant sort of embrace of what's called logical positivism and logical behaviorism, as well as other metaphysical views that had no place for God as an explanation or consciousness as a kind of immaterial thing, as we see in the ancients with Plato or Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas and these sorts. And that became sort of at least a dominating paradigm in much of science and philosophical academia in the early 1900s. But then there was a kind of shift after the mid 1900s where there was again a turn back to the subject, you might say, as you see it with Rene Descartes, which ironically, just to point out, a lot of the solutions that were provided to this sort of problem of consciousness that these materialists can't really explain. They don't have the resources to explain it. The solutions that have been provided since then in recent discussions after the mid 1900s have been toward something like this dualistic explanation, which we'll talk about in a moment, I'm sure, but a dualistic explanation that we are both souls and bodies, that I am a soul and a body, and that my soul has some role to play in explaining not only who I am, but my consciousness. And so the solutions to the problems of, say, logical positivism and logical behaviorism in terms of explaining consciousness itself came back into doubt again, it seems, in wider philosophical and scientific discussions, to the point where people were offering up alternative explanations that ironically begin to look more and more like Rene Descartes' solutions that he was providing to the atomists of his day.
This is where we get into the discussion of worldviews and what it means to look at reality in a certain way. So, it's possible to overplay that sort of language, but there really is something determinative that happens when you decide on a philosophy and then you approach your investigation of the world according to that philosophy. So what you're describing here sounds a lot like, actually reminds me of my friend Hans Feeney has this YouTube channel called Lutheran Satire. And he has this one great video where these two medieval religious Irishmen named Donald and Connell confront Richard Dawkins, right? And Dawkins says that, well, nobody rises from the dead because nobody has. And they say, well, how do you know that? And he says, well, we know it because no one's ever risen from the dead. And they're like, well, except for that time Jesus rose from the dead. And he says, well, that didn't happen because we know people don't rise from the dead. And they, they point out how very circular that is, that he hasn't actually proven anything. All he's done is sort of reassert his first principles of materialism. He's punting to those first principles. I get the sense that there's something actually very similar happening with the rise of what you call logical positivism, that the soul wasn't so much disproven as the rules of the game of world investigation were changed, and it didn't register according to those rules. And so we just said, we're going to deny it. We're not going to believe it anymore. Is that a fair characterization, or has science just kind of disproven the soul?
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair characterization. I don't think there are any really good reasons to reject the idea of the soul as true. I don't think science has certainly provided any good reasons. I think the way you've characterized this story is correct. Logical positivism was a thesis that said, well, we can't posit anything that can't be, verified in some way. And so if we have these entities like God or gods or spooky entities like spirits or angels or ghosts or things like that, well, we can't empirically verify it, so it can't be true. So it's kind of ruled out logically out of hand in the discussion. I think that's what's going on. I think you're right, the way you characterize it. A philosopher who's influenced me, Stephen Priest, called these limiting paradigms. And he actually used the word conditioned paradigms. Limiting paradigms or methods or conditioned methods and paradigms, they place limiting pressures on the way that we think about the world unnecessarily. They're helpful in that all schools of thought place limitations on our perspective and how we look at the world and how we investigate it. Science does that as well when we use a strictly empirical method. And it's helpful to get us so far in explaining some set of data, but it's not the end-all be-all for sure. And it doesn't have the power or the resources to rule out certain data or certain entities in the world that we might know otherwise.
So might know otherwise, that's a really important phrase, because you're alluding to the idea, it sounds like to me, that there are other ways of knowing besides empirical investigation, that we can actually check out the existence of things that are not made of matter and energy necessarily, and show that, hey, there's actual validity to this. It's not just a sort of leap of faith or superstition, as it's often characterized as. That, I think to get us there, this question might be helpful. What does a materialist who lives in the same world as you and I live in, right, who experiences many of the same things you and I experience, what does a materialist do with the experiences that are typically ascribed to the soul or to the immaterial self? In other words, how do they explain that stuff?
Yeah, there's a variety of different views on offer, and we could look at some of those views. But in short, what the materialist attempts to do is to explain it in what they see as the most commonsensical way, and that is to explain it by way of brain data or brain events. There are many materialists today, I think they're on the decline right now, though, thankfully, that would say that consciousness, this experience of what it's like to taste chocolate, or what it's like to experience friendship or experience one's spouse or something like that, that those experiences of what it is like is simply radically different from even the neurons firing in my brain. The pain that I experience, either physical pain when I'm in martial arts, if I pop my knee out of place, that's pretty painful. The pain that I experience itself is something more than the physiological data and even the neurons firing in my brain, the C fibers firing in my brain. There's something more going on about the nature of pain that is inaccessible to others. You can't directly experience my pain when I pop my knee out of place. You might have similar experiences, but you don't know my pain directly.
Which is why when that happens, I say, "Oh, I feel you." And then I immediately jump to this story. One time I had something similar happen and it hurt real bad. So I can sort of empathize with your situation, but I can't actually feel subjectively what you're feeling.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So materialists would say, well, we have all sorts of physical explanations of that, and ultimately we can explain it by way of the brain. Look at all these neural correlates of consciousness. And this is the common sort of fallback for the materialist in trying to explain consciousness or different states of consciousness. Look, we can point it out in a brain map in some way. We can make all these elaborate brain maps about what's actually seems to be going on, or at least correlating with the experiences that the individual is having, whether it be pain experiences, euphoria, or states of sleepiness or something of the sort. We have lots of data about that and we can explain it. But again, that doesn't quite explain what's going on in the experience itself. There's something that is left unaccounted for that is quite important, vital even, and something that we would consider as persons a part of the sort of story or narrative that makes life most interesting itself, and that is the feltness of the experience, the desires that are in the experience themselves. These things cannot be explained by the brain states, although materialists would argue otherwise.
Tell me what you think about this, Joshua. It seems like there are two controlling, I guess, metaphors or thoughts in the foreground for modern people on this question that are muddying things for us and making it hard for us to talk about them. The first one you just mentioned, it was the brain scan. I think a lot of people have this general sense, without having ever actually studied the subject, that neurologists can put some nodes on top of your skull and then see the electrical activity inside your neurons in your brain, and then they could just like map thought, that what they're actually seeing is the subjective self right there, not some correlate or downstream process that's triggered by the self. And then the second one is this thing that I've read a decent amount about, just kind of critiquing this idea, but it's the idea that our brains are essentially computers, that they work like computers. And it's actually, it turns out it's an analogy, and it's a very recent analogy, obviously because computers are recent, but it's not the first analogy. Westerners have actually used every stage of technology as an analogy for whether it's, gears and cogs or the steam engine or like fluid mechanics, as an analogy for the brain, and therefore, in some sense, for the self. What do you think about those two background ideas, and how do we need to be on guard against them? Or do you think we can kind of accept them?
Yeah, what's interesting, there's a lot interesting about that, what you just raised. I mean, when you read even neuroscientists or popular neuroscientists out there today claiming that there is no such thing as a soul. In fact, Sean Carroll famously said, or implied at least, that souls are crazy ideas and there's no place for souls in the picture that physics gives us. Then when you look at neuroscientists who are trying to make sense of consciousness, they'll make these interesting moves where they'll talk about persons or subjects or subjective states as being, they'll use the language, as you say, as code talk, or they'll use language of computer talk or machinery or mechanisms that they can point out in brain states that they can map in complex ways. And really, interestingly, they're kind of just adopting one reductionism that comes from, a lot of people will say, came from Rene Descartes, in place of another one. They're taking one reductionism as the comprehensive explanation of their world. And they're adopting a certain language strategy to make sense of this other set of data over here. And what they end up doing is they end up conflating these external properties or events in the brain that they can point out with these internal properties that only subjects know about or have access to. And furthermore, then they end up making these really strange claims that, well, your feeling of euphoria is somewhere here in the brain, or your experience of pain is somewhere over here. It's where the brain is, or where this brain event is, that's where your experience therein lies, which is interesting because when you press them on it, they'll end up saying something like, well, it exists here, but not in the same way that the physical exists here. And so they have to end up somewhat equivocating on what it means to be a subject compared to an object, or a person compared to brain states. So they end up equivocating on these sorts of terms and adopting a strategy that they think does sufficient work to make sense of persons. So I think it's important to point that out to people as they're thinking or reading a lot of these popular discussions, even by recognized experts and authorities in science who are platformed as experts on consciousness. It's important to point these things out, that many times what they're doing is they're adopting a language strategy that ends up equivocating or muddying the waters, so to speak, when there's something, there's some set of data there that they're implicitly smuggling in to the discussion that they're actually not making sense of. But what's interesting is when you train yourself to see it, you can begin to see, there's these implicit assumptions that even they're making that they can't seem to make sense of in their own methods, their own respective methods.
You hear it very quickly. You hear those assumptions when the explanatory language of nothing but comes out. So it's this reduction of everything that we talk about when we talk about being human, the experience of being human, to nothing but. So that really all that happiness and sadness and love and joy and knowledge and everything that it means to be human, to be a thinking mind, everything that is, it's just reducible to brain states, right? It's just reducible to a certain configuration of chemicals inside the gray matter. So it's nothing but. And that's very interesting because you can actually investigate that empirically on some level, or at least you can show that there is a gap or a lacuna in our understanding of how the brain works versus what we experience, actually. So I remember on Breakpoint a while back, we wrote about Wilder Penfield, who back in the 70s did these, he's a neurologist, a brain surgeon, who did these experiments on patients that may not have been, considered strictly ethical in the modern day, but back then they were actually quite groundbreaking. And what he'd do is he'd, have someone's brain open, and then he'd use an electrode to stimulate certain parts of their brain. And he'd say, okay, I'm going to stimulate this motor center here that's going to cause you to lift your arm. Tell me what you experience, because people are conscious during this thing. And, they would lift their arm because the electrode would be doing that. And he'd say, well, describe your experience. And the curious thing he discovered is that he did not induce in the patient the will or intention to lift their arm. He simply induced the motion. And the patient actually experienced it as an outside imposition of some kind, almost like a reflex, something that they didn't will to happen, but just happened to them physically. So they knew the difference. So that means that he wasn't manipulating, if there is a seat of consciousness in the brain, he wasn't manipulating that. He was only manipulating the mechanical motor functions, which is very interesting. And to this day, as I understand it, we still don't know where exactly you would go in the brain to create not just movement, but the intention to move. Apparently, it's very, very elusive.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, certainly I think what we can say is that there are causal triggers that go back and forth. There's certainly lots of correlative data that we can point to that make sense of potential causes. Certainly causal triggers that come from brain or that are externally acting upon the brain that then causally have some effect on the mind or the conscious states. And I think we could arguably make a good case that there's causal triggers that go the other way from our mind back to our brain, that our mind even begins to shape our brain in some ways and the chemical states in our bodies in ways that have, conditioned effects over long periods of time, over our emotional states and the like. So I think there's a two-way causal flow of communication and information, both from the body to the soul and the soul to the body. And I think this is really just quite commonsensical in many ways. And I think there's lots that we can point to in science to sort of beef that up as probably true. But again, even the causal triggerings between both the body and the soul, or the body and the mind, and vice back and forth the other way, it doesn't show the identity of the two. It doesn't show that one is reducible to the other necessarily, but it does show that there is this complex set of information coming from both sides that seem to suggest two different types of things that we need in order to explain different parts of different aspects or features of the world. This is why when you're counseling someone or someone's going to counseling, there may be some help in drawing upon brain scans and seeing what sort of dominant parts of the brain are activated, especially during certain experiences. There may be some role that medication plays in affecting the conscious states of awareness or the emotions that somebody has. But there's also a need in psychology, of course, for testimonial data that can only be given by the person, by the subject who has the experiences themselves, that can't be adequately or certainly not comprehensively explained by the scientific information that they might derive from a brain scan.
I'm talking today with Joshua Farris, author of The Creation of Self. We're discussing the existence of the soul and how to prove it in a materialist age. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. The critical theories that dominate our cultural vocabulary aren't just theories. They form an entire worldview that fundamentally contradicts the good, true, and beautiful worldview of Christianity. Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer's latest book, Critical Dilemma, can help you understand and respond to the bad ideas of critical theory with discernment and truth. Request your copy this month at colsoncenter.org/upcriticaldilemma. We're back on Upstream talking with Joshua Farris about the existence of the soul using his book, The Creation of Self. Joshua, one of the things that just sticks in my mind as the ultimate defeater of this materialist reductionist idea that we are only our brains, or that what we call our souls are sort of epiphenomena that emerge from material realities, is actually summarized well by C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles. And in the opening parts of that book, he talks about this thing he calls the whole show, right? By which he means the materialist view of the world as this closed, causal, determined system. And he says the critique he levels against the idea of materialism is that if it's true, then your brain, which you've just said is all you actually are, is within that causal series of dominoes. And thus the thoughts that your brain produces are actually meaningless when it comes to truth. They bear no relation to truth value. And so all thoughts, whether right or wrong or just totally insane, are all equally determined by some brain state. And you can't adjudicate between them with your materialistic brain. I thought that was very, very effective. And it's just, what do materialists make of that sort of argument in your reading?
I think that's a good argument from Lewis. Certainly, that's philosophers have picked that up and developed it in various ways, and they've called it the argument from reason. That there is something about our mental states and reasons that we have access to that seem to make sense of the world, or at least provide partial explanations of what's going on in the world. That if naturalism is true, right, as you said, then that means that the universe is closed in some way, closed from outside causes that are outside of the physical realm or the natural physical realm. So everything's explained by natural causes, triggers and pulleys, you might say, biological and chemical explanations. And nothing outside of that, like purposes or reasons, actually provide real explanations. They're actually illusory. And the naturalist view, there is no such thing as reason's explanation. In fact, like you say, they would be determined. So there are lots of physicalists out there who would argue that, in fact, reasons are illusory. So reasons are not real, or at least reasons are. Some would say, well, maybe they are real, but they have no causal role to play in the world. They don't do any work for us. They don't explain anything, but they exist nonetheless, but they're kind of just hanging out there. We might experience them, but they don't actually do anything. They're wholly determined by biophysical and chemical
I
explanations.
notice you've got kind of a smile as you say that, and I've noticed everyone who says that, even believing it, also has that kind of wry smile because they know that what they're saying actually undermines the basis for their saying it. So, because they're saying that they lack any sort of objective touch with this thing called truth or reality, that their brain state that says that is just determined. And so, like, why should I believe it? My brain state is just as determined as theirs is.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's humorous because there is humor in it. I think even the sort of dogmatic materialist will have a hard time believing it. I think, practically speaking, they can actually believe it when they wake up in the morning and they have to make a decision about what they're going to do as they get out of bed. Are they going to make coffee first? Are they going to go for a jog first? Or are they going to jump in the shower and get ready for workday?
Or they get a phone call that says someone they love has died.
Yeah, yeah, right. Wow. I mean, that's a whole reason that would reshape their whole day. That, yeah, how would you even make sense of the experiences and the decisions you're going to make based upon the fact that your loved one has just passed in biochemical ways? I wonder. Yeah. How would you
And
make
how
sense?
can you still love them given that the them no longer exists? There is an ongoing love, and they would have to at some point, I guess, say that's irrational that I have ongoing feelings for someone who has ceased to exist because the someone was just an illusion that emerged from a particular neurological configuration. It's bleak. It'll come as news to nobody that materialism is pretty bleak, but it is really quite bleak once you start thinking through it consistently.
Yes, yeah, it is. I agree. I agree. It is. It's bleak. It's sad. It's like pointing back to one of the other Lewis narratives, The Great Divorce, right, where he talks about different worlds as being gray or something of the sort, gray and dark. It kind of evokes that kind of picture of the world. And again, as many philosophers have talked about, and literary writers have talked about, it makes the world disenchanted. That's one popular way of putting it. Makes the world disenchanted, uninteresting.
You have this excellent discussion. I think it's in chapter 3. I have to go back and check. But it's about how, in some sense, belief in a soul or an immaterial self is innate or natural to us. It happens very naturally. That there have been studies that demonstrate that apparently children come up with this idea on their own. Could you describe for us the experience? And I'm sure we'll recognize it in our own stories, but the experience of what it is like to come to believe that you have a soul and why that is natural, or rather that you are a soul.
Yeah, so there's lots of recent work in cognitive science, neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, as well as developmental psychology, that points out the strong suggestive data that we begin as dualists. In fact, we begin as children believing quite naturally in the idea of souls, the idea of God, and even morality. These things are almost, as it were, built into our cognitive structure. And they incline us, once we interact with people in the environment, they incline us. There's something about our structures that incline us to believe that these things are actually true. There's something innate and natural about them. And I would suggest those are innate and naturally good about our cognitive structures that we should develop further. There's an innate, even natural law that is part of our structure that we should develop and think about. So Paul Bloom is one of the famous developmental psychologist who has motivated this, and this idea, he's written several articles arguing to this effect, that we are natural born dualists, and even related to that, natural born theists, or some sort of generic theist at least. And so he actually wrote a book, Descartes' Baby, and he argues in there that there's pretty strong, overwhelming data that we naturally believe that we are souls, or that we have souls, and that potentially we could even exist disembodied, and we naturally incline to believe in the afterlife and in God without any additional tutoring, although tutoring is helpful in that way. That's why we should catechize our children and teach them. But anyway, that's another discussion.
Well, that would go a long way to explaining the kind of historical consensus we mentioned at the beginning, and even just going back to very, very, very primitive stuff, right? What we think of as the most primitive people. Chesterton might quibble with that, but there's archaeological sites with cavemen where they buried their dead with flowers. And it's like, what's being done there exactly? I mean, what animals don't do that with each other's bodies. They kind of just leave it. I mean, I guess the closest you could come is the mothers that sort of carry around the body of their infant that dies for a while. And some of the higher, like the more intelligent animals will do that. But this whole burial thing, this whole like suggestion that, well, they're not really gone. There's still a somebody somewhere, that is like implicit in human burial rites throughout history. And we seem to come to it quite independently and quite consistently without anybody, helping us or indoctrinating us. And I guess that innate sense is something of an argument for its being natural or perhaps even real.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about the cave paintings, but there are lots of cave paintings that suggest that truth, as well as there's cave paintings that suggest something about the afterlife, something about the transcendence of personhood to something else, whatever that may be.
So much so that we'll throw away good treasures and stuff to, put them down in the ground with the dead. Like, why would you do that?
That's right. That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. Yes.
So this leads us into the part of the discussion where I think we need to talk about the nuts and bolts of what is the soul. What is it that you're arguing for the soul is? What is this neo-Cartesian dualist idea that you're advancing? And then how does it compare to some of the other things on offer? We've talked about materialism, but what other views are there on offer for the definition of the soul?
Yeah, so in the creation of self, I'm developing this argument for a particular view of the soul, as you point out, and I call it the neo-Cartesian view, which is largely a term of art, referencing a set of views about soul, personhood, consciousness in relation to the body that goes back to René Descartes, or finds its influence in René Descartes, and finds a lot of the sort of essential ideas in Descartes' understanding. Descartes described the soul as the kind of thing that has capacity for thought. It's the kind of thing that has capacity for experience. That we talked about. So these events that we experience that are not physically explainable, reducible, they're not identical to our brain states or neurons firing, but there's something else. There seems to be something that logically makes sense of them or owns them, in other words. And so Descartes makes much of this idea that these are irreducible. They can't be eliminated. They can't be captured, in other words, by the body or the physical. And so these cluster of ideas seem to comprise what it means to be, or at least give some description, some content to what it means to be a soul. A soul is a subject of experience or subject of thoughts. And it's roughly the definition that I'm working with in the creation of self. And more to the point, I do try to add a little bit more detail to that. I try to refine Descartes a little bit more and say, whether or not Descartes actually believed this or he would have agreed with this, who knows? But I try to make sense of that there is something about the nature of particularity, there's something about the nature of individuality in terms of the person that the soul captures better than the body, that there's something about the nature of the soul that makes me, and your soul that makes you. And there's something about the nature of individuality that is captured by the soul. And so I think this was an intuition I had in my seminary time when I was taking theology too, and we were thinking about what it means to be a human being and all sorts of questions about the relationship of gender and the body and these sorts of things. And it seemed to me that there's something about the nature of our particularity that is transcendent, that is at one level deeply mysterious, not mysterious in one sense that we can't say anything about it or that it's wholly elusive, but it's mysterious in a way that I think captures something about the nature of the world and reality that's really significant and important. And so it's that Cartesian idea that I think is right. And on that basis, I attempt to develop a larger argument for the soul as necessary for explaining aspects or features of the world that we otherwise couldn't or would certainly have a hard time explaining. So you asked the second part of your question. You ask about what are the other views out there that you might think about. So I do interact particularly with the object of my sort of argument and criticism is not just these views of persons that are wholly physicalist in nature, but also you might call them naturalist competitors, or in some ways even atheistic competitors, secular competitors. Maybe that would be a better word for it. I mean, not all these individuals are explicitly affirming or embracing atheism. That might be too strong. But there are other views that make sense of the soul or consciousness by way of natural mechanisms or biological mechanisms. And there's an underlying sort of belief or thought in much of contemporary philosophical and scientific literature, science and religion literature, that we can make sense of persons by way of, or the origins of persons by way of these sort of general biological or evolutionary mechanisms. And so my argument is that the sorts of views on persons or souls that are motivating this argument don't seem to get at or don't seem to explain, even may even contradict this underlying intuition that we have about what's so unique, transcendent about the nature of persons themselves. They lack the explanatory resources to make sense of those things. And in fact, I suggest in many places that some may be contradictory, some may just lack the resources altogether to make sense of the fact of personhood. And their resources are limited in explaining the origins of personhood or the origins of this particularity that is so mysterious at one level, unique, and something that makes me me. There's something about the biological and even biological mechanisms that are inadequate to explain or make sense of the fact that I come into existence or you come into existence. Certainly, there's something about the nature of your parents, your progenitors, that give to you a certain life, a biological life. There's certainly a gifting of genetics and history and all sorts of things that are real. But there's also something about the nature of you that makes you you that biological explanations fall short in accounting for.
I guess part of what helps me to understand that is when you think about what a body is, right? And a body is really, there's some identity to it over time, mostly in terms of information, right? In the DNA and the way it's organized according to that. But in reality, materially speaking, the body is not a continuous thing over time. In fact, your whole body is replaced materially every few years. I think it's like every 7 years or something. Almost every molecule that makes up your physically will be replaced. So it's like a ship of Theseus problem. Like you're constantly being remade in real time. You're more like the edge of a waterfall, which looks like it's there, but really it's just water moving in the same direction again and again. That creates that illusion of thisness, if you want to put it that way. So you have that problem. Like, what is a person? If all we've got to account for it are these cells, then what exactly is a person across time? Who is the person that I refer to as Joshua Farris? And to me, we'll make a pop culture reference here because this will probably help listeners. To me, this was really brought up very well, though maybe unintentionally, by the James Cameron's recent sequel to Avatar, right? So not without spoiling too much, I guess I'll spoil something, but the villain in that, the villain died in the last movie, right? His body is dead. But what they've managed to do is bring him back in a new body by imprinting his memories on this new body. And they play with the distinction, like, is this him? Is this not him in the new one? And ultimately it kind of ends up on, yes, it's him, because some immaterial imprint of himness has been placed on this materially distinct body, and now it's him again. But they don't bring in the concept of the soul, at least not explicitly. It's very much just explained in those. You're differentiating between the terms materialist, physicalist, and naturalist, but it's one of those terms, right? It's just stuff, but they're still kind of saying he's there somewhere.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good movie illustration, as well as the ship of Theseus. It's a good illustration to point out that there's something about the nature of the matter that itself, at least what we know about it and what we know about it that's available publicly, doesn't adequately make sense of me. There's something else about me that makes me, apart from the sort of the material stuff giving rise to the whole thing, like the wood beams in the ship, or the genetics, the blood and guts in me, or even the genetics, of course, or even my genealogical explanation, which goes a long way in maybe explaining certain things about me, where I came from, all these sorts of things. It does a lot. It says a lot about me, but it doesn't quite capture the me that is me. And I think that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, there's something about, people talk about, philosophers talk about these intuitions of the possibility. Now, I don't know if this is actually could happen, but the possibility that we could even swap bodies. I mean, at some level,
Like a Freaky Friday kind of thing.
Yeah, Freaky Friday. That's right. That's right. Yeah, there's several other movies we could point to as well. But I mean, at some level, even in the Christian story, I think there is something about our body swapping intuitions that motivate the possibility that we could even conceive of the fact that this body dies, and however you make sense of this body raising, there's something about my being me that swaps from this earthly body to this resurrected body. And so Cartesianism makes sense of that. The fact that we are souls makes sense of that as well.
Okay, here I've got to ask this question because there's this fake C.S. Lewis quote that goes around where he's supposed to say, "You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body." Now, it sounds like to me this neo-Cartesian view puts you in agreement with fake Lewis or fake Lewis's quote. Is that accurate? Or is that an accurate way of putting it? And then what would someone who comes from a more Aristotelian Thomist view of the soul, so like the kind of medieval Christian view, say in response to that? And just sort of play with that distinction for us.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do engage with the Aristotelian Thomist view a bit in the book. Although I think it's a better view than the sort of naturalist competitors. I do want to point that out. So I'm happy. I'm much happier with the Thomist. So I do want to put that up front. I do want to say that. I'm glad they believe in an actual soul. Yeah. So I think I like the quote. I think there are problems with the quote, or at least it evokes certain implications or pictures of that are commonly pictured when we think about something like Descartes' view. Descartes' view is often kind of the whipping boy in much of philosophy, as well as, sociology and even theology today.
People call it the ghost in the machine view.
That's right, yeah. Or the man flying in the jet plane or something like that, where he's just this individual that has all these controls before him that he can make control. And there's a lack of a sort of integrated picture. So that fake Lewis quote does give off that kind of idea. I think in the ways that we've just been describing, I think there is something true about our body swapping intuitions. But when we start going down that line, there are these obvious questions, right? Well, what about the body? We need to say something a little bit more about that and how the soul's integrated with the body. I mean, the fact of the matter is that our minds are functionally dependent on our brains, certainly in this life. There's lots of common sense things. When I hit my head on the doorpost, or I come up from the car and I hit my head on the glove compartment, it hurts me, and I experience different conscious states.
It hurts you too. It's not like you're getting a fax from your body that's saying, "Oh, the body is hurting." It's like, no, you subjectively actually hurt, like that knee injury we talked about earlier in martial arts.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I hurt, and I experience that hurt. So there is something deeply integrative about my body and soul, and I think a neo-Cartesian can make sense of that. This sort of bifurcated picture that it often gives to people, I think, is a little unfortunate. It's understandable given I think the radically distinct natures in which the soul can exist and the body can exist. The body's going to go in the grave at some point. And presumably, that our persons are going to live on in some way. And so that evokes a kind of different picture. I think that even raises questions about, well, what about the denigration of the body. Is the body a bad thing, right? Those are common questions that are raised. Is
You may even hear a sort of charge of Gnosticism thrown around, that
Gnosticism,
that
of
maybe
course.
this is
Yeah,
the real us is our soul. So Gnostics have this idea of the prison house, the body being the prison house of the soul, and we escape, and that's we're just purified, like we're returned to our angelic state.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, and Plato uses something of that metaphor as well in his writings. Yeah, I think. And I do allude to this, although it's not the direct attention in this book, The Creation of Self. I do allude to a more functionally integrated view of the soul and body. The soul in this life is dependent upon the body and the brain, the central nervous system, in a deep and intimate way. And there's something even unnatural about the soul decoupling from the body that's really painful in one sense and emotionally tumultuous to think about. Death is hard to think about because of how enmeshed we are in our bodies, how much we depend upon our bodies. And I think there's even a more rigorous way in which a Cartesian can even say that the soul is dependent on the body in an intimate way, and even in an analogous way, in some ways similar to the medieval picture or portrait of the soul and the body. Yeah, so I mean, given the kind of picture that we just put forward and the common picture of the ghost in the machine and these sorts of things, those are real questions that people have in their minds. And I probably can't persuade all of them or disabuse them of that picture of Cartesianism in this short period of time. I don't think that the view lends itself to that. I think it's an unfortunate metaphor, somewhat understandable, but I think it overplays the distinction that the Cartesian makes between the soul and body in a way that I think is probably inaccurate to how, at least most contemporary Cartesians think of the soul and body relationship.
Right. And it seems, and I'm speaking as a complete layman here, obviously, without a exactly settled view on any of this, beyond just believing that the biblical data that the soul is real and we survive our deaths. But one of the problems you point out with the Aristotelian Thomist view, or the kind of hylomorphic, as it's called, view, is that if our selfhood emerges out of a composite of body and soul, then it means, strictly speaking, and as I understand it, Thomas actually said this, strictly speaking, you cease to exist when you die. There is a part of you that survives death, but that part of you, the soul, is not actually you. The immaterial part is not all of you. It's sort of like a bit of you that preserves your identity. And then he just sort of like punted to divine goodness, as God preserves by his mercy this person so that eventually in the resurrection, they can actually be raised and made whole again. And that seems like a point of possible vulnerability or critique. But again, I haven't read enough Thomas or Aristotle to say whether it holds or not, but it seems to be a critique you're making.
I think you're right, and I think well, obviously, I think you're right. You read that in my book. Yeah, I think there's a common, and I didn't even point to half the literature on this. There's a lot of literature discussing this precise issue. There's this big question about Aristotelianism, Thomist dualism, whether or not the soul actually survives, and if it does survive, what is it that is actually surviving? There's a reason why that question is raised and is so important. And it's very difficult to make a coherent or to make coherent sense or to provide a coherent picture of the fact that the person actually does survive on Thomism or Aristotelianism. That is I think the real weakness. And I think it's a pretty powerful weakness of Thomism, especially when we consider survival, resurrection, and even, well, here we're getting into much more explicit theological territory, the disembodied intermediate state, if that is in fact a teaching of the Christian church.
Yes. Well, people are depicted in that state as talking, worshiping, praying, seeking. I mean, they're doing conscious things as disembodied souls in that intermediate state. So which view best makes sense of that biblical data? I guess that's a real live question for me.
That's right. That's right. I think Cartesianism obviously makes better sense of that data in a better way than even the Thomist.
So as we wrap up here, I think we've hit this explicitly theological territory. And obviously this is a Christian podcast. We wanted to go there, but I think it's very important that we got here by a more stepwise, sort of roundabout, circuitous route. But we're here talking about God and the afterlife and the scriptural data. You are a Christian. What does all this mean for you as a Christian specifically? How has this neo-Cartesian view of the soul and all your thinking about it that went into this book affected your walk with God and your hope?
Yeah. Good question. Big question. I think, well, there's several things I could say. I don't know. I'll try to keep it brief. One is that this book is more of a piece of natural theology, you might say. I'm really trying to kind of lay the groundwork, as it were, for saying that we are souls and that these souls depend upon theism, which is an unpopular position in consciousness studies today. And it's not getting platformed very much. There are lots of secular alternatives right now. And even it depends upon something like creationism of the soul, that God directly and immediately creates the soul, the person.
That's a term of art often confused for another term of art. So we should probably just briefly say what we're talking about there.
It's not young earth creationism. I'm not talking about young earth. I'm not making any claims about the age of the earth or how the physical world came about in terms of various mechanisms, evolutionary mechanisms, or what have you. It's a term of art, a common to the tradition of theology, but not so common today, not probably less recognized today in common discourse. It's the idea that the soul is created rather than being generated in some way by biology or physical mechanisms or what have you, that there's something about the nature of the soul that's directly and immediately brought about by a personal being, a divine being. And I think it's important. I'm a big believer in, natural law theology, that there's a lot that God reveals in his creation, in nature. And there's a lot of work going on today, even within broadly Christian circles, that has almost no place for specific or biblical revelation, particular revelation. And they're trying to make sense of the world in purely nature terms or purely creation. And I think the argument of the book points us in a roundedly theistic, creationist in terms of the soul, a creationist view of the soul, that I think the careful reader will see that there's a lot we can know about the soul. There's a lot we can know about the world and even God from the world. But there is something that it directs us to. It directs us to revelation. There's a need for biblical revelation. So there's limitations even on what we can know about the human being from natural theology or from philosophy itself, from rigorous metaphysics. We need revelation. And that, in particular, as I've been engaging in this particular discussion with secularists in Europe, in America, I've seen a reticence to accept any kind of biblical revelation, even amongst the broadly Christian types. So in reflecting on this, it's really pointed me to the reality that we need divine revelation in our lives. And I think the argument of the book at least suggestively pushes us there, that we need revelation.
Absolutely. What's the biggest, most vital takeaway you want people to have from both this conversation and from your book if they pick it up?
I think that there is much more to reality than meets the eye, and certainly the empirical eye. And I think the soul is helpful for opening up that world that otherwise might have been closed off in ways that maybe we don't even quite see ourselves because of cultural conditioning, because of conditioning from cultural authorities that have played a role in our lives. I think this opens up the door to understand God and reality.
Amen. Well, folks, I had a coworker slap me on the wrist for having these conversations with authors and just spoiling the entire book. So I want to emphasize that we have not covered the half of this book. We've given you a very brief overview of some of the key questions, but there's a lot more to it. My guest today has been Joshua Farris. His book is called The Creation of Self, A Case for the Soul. Joshua, thank you so much for joining me and for helping us dig into this deep and vital conversation. I can hardly think of a more important conversation for human beings to have than this one. So thank you.
Thank you, Shane.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.